When I was in college, a few of my high school friends and I loved hanging out on the weekends. We would often sit in our local woods, buy alcohol, and have a few drinks together. On one Saturday in July, we decided to head out to a forest a few miles away. It was daylight, and we planned to explore as much of it as possible before it got dark. The forest was really dense in most places, and a lot of daylight was shrouded in shadow, even when the sun was at its highest. But it was calm and peaceful. The forest was located behind a prison, which added a bit of fear to the experience. However, since it was daylight, we didn't think too much of it. Once we stepped into the forest, we pushed our way through the dense trees for about 45 minutes. We were chatting away and just catching up as friends do. Not long after, we saw something through the trees in the near distance. When we reached it, we realized it was a fully built small cabin. It was hexagonal in shape, with thick walls and a roof made of sticks and mud. There was a huge, deep fire pit next to the cabin, and trash scattered everywhere. It looked as though it had been used recently. We were unsettled, but it was still daylight and the forest was calm. We shared thoughts about who could have built it, and even suggested that an escaped prisoner had wandered into the forest and built it after escaping. Looking back now, an escaped prisoner probably wouldn't hide in a forest directly behind the prison and build a cabin. We were young, though, and excited by the mystery. The cabin didn't have a door, so we assumed there wasn't much inside. But we went in anyway to look around. When we stepped inside, we noticed a bunch of tools hanging on the log's walls. Rusty saws, hammers, and screwdrivers. This unsettled us even more, and we debated leaving before whoever built the place returned. But because we were young adults, and there were 4 of us, we convinced ourselves we would be fine. Not only did we decide to stay, but we also took the tools and headed even deeper into the forest in an attempt to build our own cabin. A few hours later, after only managing to stack a few logs, we got bored and decided to call it a day. We left the tools where we had started building our structure and neglected to return them. We were tired and, after lying around and resting for a while, unintentionally forgot about the tools altogether. Fast forward a week, and we decided to return to the forest to find that cabin again, to see if anything had changed and perhaps continue building our own. Before heading out, we bought a bag of marshmallows from our local store so we could start a fire in the fire pit and roast them. When we arrived at the forest, it was quite late and the sun was beginning to set. That was intentional. We wanted a glowing fire in the dark to enjoy with our drinks and snacks. When we reached the cabin site, we noticed it had been destroyed. All the logs had been torn down and scattered across the area. We debated what might have happened, but we figured that when the person or people who built it returned and found their tools missing, they decided to tear the cabin down because it had been discovered. We were worried that someone might come back once we lit the fire, but we still wanted to stick to the plan as much as possible. For a while, we had a great time. We had a few drinks, roasted marshmallows, and my friend, who had brought his guitar, played a few songs for us. After an hour or so, we saw flashlights between the trees some distance away, followed by shouting. We noticed a few men heading toward us. Because the forest was so dense, it slowed them down, but they were definitely coming our way. We looked at each other, trying to come up with a plan. We knew the forest would be difficult to navigate in the dark, especially to the south, where it became even thicker. If we went that way, we risked being cornered. Devin and I wanted to run. The other 2 thought we would get caught anyway and suggested either hiding nearby or trying to reason with the men. Devin and I ran. We didn't want to head left or right, afraid they might cut us off. That left only one option: south, into the deeper, thicker forest. We each had our own flashlight, but we tried to conceal as much of the light as possible so the men would either lose track of us or not see us at all. After a grueling 20 minutes of running through the thick woods, branches scratching nearly every part of our bodies, we reached a barbed wire farmer's fence. We looked back and couldn't see anything, but we could still hear the men in the distance. We knew we didn't have much time. The fence stretched endlessly in both directions. So we decided to climb it and hope they wouldn't follow. I took the hoodie from around my waist and draped it over part of the barbed wire to protect us. But we were still cut in a few places. Somehow, we managed to make it over to the other side. Instead of continuing south, we decided to move along the fence line until we found a safer place to cross back and circle around the men. We had no idea what was happening to our other two friends. But at that moment, we were more focused on not getting caught, especially now that we had jumped onto someone's farm property. After a while, we found a section of fence we could safely climb back over into a less dense part of the forest. We had no signal on our phones and couldn't call our friends to check if they were okay. We continued walking for a little longer and eventually found an exit out of the forest. We couldn't hear anything behind us anymore, but we could see houses in the distance. We decided to head toward them and stand under the street lamps before figuring out what to do next. As we got closer, we saw that our other two friends were already standing under a street lamp near the houses. We ran up to them and asked what had happened. They explained that they had decided to hide because they couldn't run effectively while carrying the guitar, and it had worked. The men arrived at the fire while they were hiding behind some logs, just outside the glow of the flames. They said the men looked much older than us and seemed aggressive. They appeared to be carrying crowbars or something similar. When the men heard Devin and me crashing through the forest, they decided to chase us into the dense woods, giving our two friends the chance to escape easily. As our friends were heading toward the edge of the forest, they noticed a pickup truck parked on the logging trail with its headlights on, but no one inside. We think it must have been their truck. All four of us ran toward the nearby houses, where we finally regrouped. We went back to that forest a few more times after that night, but we never ventured as deep as we did that day. This happened a while back when I was living near El Paso, Texas, in a small desert town. For context, the houses in this area are not centralized in one town location, but rather spread out within a 10-mile vicinity of cabins and small homes. We don't get much crime here, but when we do, it's scary. For example, a few miles to the east, where it's just desert for miles, is a meeting place for a local cult. It's a small group of like-minded crazies with the willpower to commit atrocities. A few years ago, one of their members broke into an office in town and took 2 workers hostage. Thankfully, they made it out with their lives. At the time, I was living in a small cabin north of town. I was 27, not someone to be messed with, based on appearance. I'm 6'3" and work out quite often, so I was one of the bigger people in town. One night, a few days after Christmas, I was sitting near my fireplace, getting warm and winding down. I had been working on my truck that afternoon because I had gone off-roading the day before and busted the suspension. To my surprise, I heard a loud knock on my old wooden door. I called out, "Who is it?" Then, without warning, 2 large men entered. wearing large gray sombreros and holding Colt Python revolvers. My chair was far from the door and close to my bedroom, so I immediately rushed to my bedroom during the ordeal and grabbed my double-barrel shotgun before the intruders were able to get to me. The shotgun was very large and very powerful. I had 2 shells loaded and not enough time to get to my ammo box, so I just had to hope that would be enough. The guys rushed in after me, but when I placed my much larger barrel in their faces, they began running. They rushed out as fast as they had arrived. I exited after them and fired a warning shot into the cold desert air. I didn't have a cell phone at the time, and my landline had been out of service for as long as I had it. I got into my old, broken-down Ford, still a little damaged from before, though I'd fixed most of it, and rushed to the nearest law station to report what had happened. For some reason, they took my shotgun and returned it a week later. To this day, I don't know who was responsible, but I personally believe the cult put them up to it. Why I was chosen, I don't know. I never had any bad run-ins with anybody in town, and I've lived there my whole life. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and the summer here can be a bit brutal. My grandparents own a cabin up in the woods in the northern part of the state, and once or twice a year we like to go up there to decompress. It was mid-July, and I had just worked 8 days straight. I had 3 days off in a row, and I decided I would head up to the Pines. It was a spontaneous idea, so I couldn't get anybody to go with me. The only ones who came with me were my 2 small French bulldogs. We left the valley and headed up that way, and it was a nice feeling that the temperature dropped immediately after ascending into the mountains. I could tell the dogs were loving the nice, clean air, and I was excited to spend the weekend with them in solitude. We arrived at the cabin. It's on a dirt road on a couple of acres. There wasn't another house for another quarter of a mile or so on that same dirt road. No street lights, no noises of busy streets or freeways, and no light pollution at all. It was 9:15 p.m., and everything was pitch black. I unlocked the door, set down my first set of bags, and went back to get the dogs out of the car. The 4-hour drive drained me, so I sat on the couch with the TV on and drifted off to sleep. A couple of hours later, I awoke abruptly to my 2 dogs barking aggressively at the big windows in the living room. I turned off the TV and all the lights so that I could see what was outside. I've never feared the dark or the woods, but still to this day, when I think about this moment, I get chills down my spine. I felt an unusual sensation of being watched, and I did not like it at all. The dogs were still going crazy, but I couldn't really see much. I definitely was not going outside. I eventually drifted back to sleep, only to be woken up again. This time, the dogs were barking at the windows on the other side of the house. I went over there to look out the window, and it was cracked open. There was a stick in the window seal preventing it from being opened. I wasn't sure if it was already like this when I got there or if somebody had just tried to open the window. Needless to say, I was on high alert. Another hour went by, and it was 3 a.m. I decided to call my grandma, who was 3 hours ahead on the East Coast, and asked her about it. She could have left the window cracked the last time she was at the cabin. I found out that I had no reception, and that was when I really started to panic. The dreadful feeling of being watched had been replaced by the feeling of being hunted, and I didn't know why the dogs were on high alert as well. I just had to make it 3 more hours until the sun came up. Then I was going to get in my car and head back home. Suddenly, I saw the porch light shut off. I tried to turn it back on, but the power had been cut. I tried to dial 911, but again, there was no reception. Now all the times someone had told me to invest in a firearm flashed through my head, and I really wished I had one. But I didn't. I was armed with a kitchen knife instead, and a heavy-duty walking stick. The two dogs, although not violent, seemed to be warding off this thing or person so far. A part of me wanted to go flip the breaker outside, but I didn't think that was wise. Whatever or whoever was doing that had probably set a trap for me out there. Just as I was sitting there, thinking of how I could swiftly exit, I heard the sound of shattering glass, and behind it, a tall, slim man speaking a language I had never heard. I froze in shock, but my dogs retreated to the back bedroom, so I snapped out of it and followed them. I was in my grandparents' bedroom. I slammed the door behind us and barricaded it with a dresser. There was a window in the room, and it was only a matter of time until that was breached. A million thoughts were racing through my head, and I couldn't help but notice my grandpa's old World War II memorabilia. I thought to myself that I bet Grandpa, who loved guns, had to have one stashed in there. I moved swiftly, looking for a firearm in my grandpa's room, and sure enough, I found one. An old World War II antique pistol, still intact with the original rounds. I wasn't sure if I would fire it or not, but I chambered around just like I had seen people do in video games. Just when I finished with the gun, the bedroom window shattered. The man stepped through it, and I squeezed the trigger. The gun went off. I had never shot a real gun before, and it almost flew out of my hand. But I know that I hit him. He fell backward, yelled at me, and ran away. Now it was about 4:15 a.m., and I just needed to make it another 45 minutes until the sun came up. Then I could head to the nearest sheriff's office. I sat on the ground, staring at the window, ready to fire another round for the remainder of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I took the dogs out to use the restroom while carrying the pistol under my shirt. The first thing I noticed was that my tires were slashed, so thankfully it was a good idea that I didn't try to make a quick run for it during the night. The next thing I noticed was the power box. The lock had been cut and the power shut off. After that, I saw a trail of blood leading from the master bedroom window into the woods. I walked with the dogs about a mile down the road until I had some cell phone reception. I called 911 and told them what happened. Then I called the towing company. I thought about walking to the neighbors, but the idea that he could be the suspect popped into my mind, so I decided to contact the authorities and keep to myself. I walked back to the cabin, and an hour later the sheriff came. He was an older guy who didn't seem to care much at all. He said it was probably just kids playing a prank and that I shouldn't have shot anybody. The sheriff even confiscated the gun and disassembled it right in front of me. Mad, confused, and tired, I waited for the tow truck driver, who took the dogs and me back to Phoenix. A few things stuck in my head about that night. One of them was that I never got the name of the sheriff because he never told me, and I was too shaken up to ask. I called the sheriff's office to follow up, but they had no record of the incident and no record of my grandfather's firearm. I still wonder to this day if the intruder survived the gunshot wound or not. I questioned whether the man was feral, because I forgot to mention earlier that he had the strongest body odor I've ever smelled on a human before. I'll never know the answers to those questions. I'm just glad that everything turned out okay and that my dogs and I didn't get injured. Needless to say, I won't be taking a solo trip to the cabin in the woods ever again. If I ever go back, I'm bringing my brothers with me. both of whom served as Marines and are not afraid of real violence. I grew up in the country. It wasn't totally the middle of nowhere, but it was definitely a step down from the suburbs. Next to my house was a massive cornfield, and although the houses on the other side and across the street were somewhat close, I also lived on a 7-acre lot. So it was somewhere between a rural area and the suburbs. Anyway, at the back of the property there was a pretty large forest that eventually led to a nature trail. Before that, though, there used to be a campground. This campground had been a pretty popular place back in the day, long before we moved there, but it eventually closed abruptly. I don't know exactly why, but I had heard talk about issues with drugs. There were also rumors that people had been attacked there. No one we knew in the area who had been around at the time really knew why it was closed. What I do know is that it shut down, and they didn't tear anything down. They just left this abandoned camp, complete with cabins, a mess hall, other buildings, and even a swimming pool. That in itself sounds creepy, and it was. At the time this story takes place, I was very young, probably 7 or 8, and pretty naive. The forest and the abandoned camp were not part of our property, which ended at the tree line. However, the owner of that property and my dad were friendly. He said he didn't care if we went back there, and he even let my dad hunt during deer season. One evening, when my mom was working nights, my dad took my sister and me back there to explore. It wasn't dark yet. It was summer, but it was getting close by the time we headed out. We explored a bit. Most of the larger buildings were locked. The pool was gross, and there were a lot of spiders around. I was starting to feel eager to head back, and it was getting dusty as well. When we checked the cabins, they were all unlocked, and some didn't even have doors. We were just looking around. In hindsight, this sounds like the beginning of a horror movie. But I didn't know any better at the time, and my dad is basically fearless. While we were inside one of the cabins, we heard voices outside. We peeked out of one of the windows and saw 2 or 3 men in their 20s or 30s. They looked rough and shifty, and they were talking loudly. It seemed like they were in a rush, like they had to hurry up and do something back there, almost as if they were looking for something. I have rarely seen my dad truly scared. While I wouldn't say he was exactly scared in that moment, I could tell he was uneasy, which was unusual for him. He stood in the doorway of the cabin while my sister and I looked out the window. I was holding a loose brick I had picked up, and my dad told me to keep hold of it unless he told me to drop it. For some reason, that detail has always stuck with me. While watching through the window, I saw one of the men look toward the cabin and make eye contact with my dad. Then they just stared at each other for a bit. It felt like forever at the time, though it probably wasn't that long. By then, I was unsettled. It was the comment my dad made about the brick that made me realize this was potentially a dangerous situation. The man whispered something to the other guy, who also looked at my dad, and then they just kind of stood there in a silent standoff. Finally, the 2 men walked away into the trees. Once my dad couldn't see them anymore, he quickly ushered us out. We headed back to the house without any problems, but my dad still seemed uneasy and kept looking behind us. Nothing ever came of that encounter. Years later, my dad told me that neither of the men we saw that day were the property owner. I suppose they could have had permission to be there. But my dad had a bad feeling, and I already knew that, even back then. because he had asked us not to tell my mom. Like I said, nothing ever came of it, and maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Even so, it creeped us all out, especially given the supposed criminal history of that abandoned campground. My dad never took us back into those woods again, at least not to the campground. He still hunted back there for years afterward, but I've never wanted to go back. When I was younger, my parents had a pretty large cabin house in the woods that we lived in. It was provided by a business partner in my dad's company as long as we paid the property tax. I guess he was holding on to the land, and he did end up selling it to a developer not long after we moved out. Anyway, it was on the edge of a large city, but still retained many acres of forest around it. You had to drive down a long gravel road to get there. There was no gate or anything. It was fairly peaceful, and nobody ever bothered us in 10 years, except once. The house was essentially a log cabin and had 8 bedrooms, an 8-car garage, and a massive full-length deck in the back. The house was set on a slope and was 3 stories tall. The middle floor was at ground level at the front of the house, but 1 story up at the back, which made the deck quite high. It was so high off the ground that you could park a car under it. And then some. The bottom floor was basically shared by my sister and me. We would drive around back and park under the deck, where we had a separate entrance to a living room and all the downstairs bedrooms. It was like our own 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom house down there. But everything was built out of logs. This house had way too many ground-level windows and doors for my liking. It was difficult to keep them all locked. It was quite a chore going around each night to make sure everything was secure. My dad had a habit of leaving a few windows or doors unlocked every day, which didn't help. I think there were 19 external doors and even more windows. So it took a while each day to make sure the house was secure. It was honestly large enough that somebody could break a window on one end, and you wouldn't know. So I was always a little worried about break-ins. One night, as we walked out onto the upper deck, it was dusk and getting quite dark. My sister and I sat down in the chairs, chatting and looking at the sky. Suddenly, we heard something moving around under the deck. It was faint, but there was scratching and a kind of shuffling, like somebody was trying to move quietly. At first, I thought nothing of it and assumed it was a cat or raccoon, as we'd seen them around before. In a deep voice, kind of jokingly, I said, "I know you're down there. Get out before I call the police." The moment I said this, a person dressed entirely in black clothing sprinted from under the deck and into the darkening woods. Needless to say, we looked at each other, surprised and kind of scared. Upon investigating further, we discovered the lurker had managed to open a downstairs bedroom window about 2 inches. I never slept well in that house again. I promptly screwed every ground floor window shut with security screws and bought a shotgun. During the daytime, I walked around the property and discovered an area near the edge of the woods with a lot of cigarette butts and beer cans of various ages, positioned with a full view of the back of the house. I have no idea how long they had been watching us. My theory is that they approached from the back woods and didn't even realize we were home. So when we walked out onto the deck directly above them, they were caught off guard and had to run.